Have you ever wondered why there's so much bad news out there? Maybe it's because people find bad news more interesting than good news. And that's to do with the property, with the economy, with politics, with everything. Interestingly, a recent study I read involved more than 1,000 people across 17 countries spanning every continent other than Antarctica, and it concluded that on average, people pay more attention to negative news than positive news. And I've found that blogs or podcasts with subject lines that are more negative, they get more attention. And Pete Wargent and I were recently talking about why those bloggers who continuously are negative about property and our economy get so many more followings than the positive people. Anyway, that's part of what we're going to discuss in today's podcast. The problem is, though, that humans do have a bias towards negative news. And unfortunately, if you have that tendency, it's going to affect the way you think, the way you feel, and the actions you take. Remember, your thoughts lead to your feelings lead to your actions lead to your results. So how can we overcome this negative bias? What is causing it, and how are we going to move forward in this new year and take advantage of all the positive things that are happening? That's what Pete Wargent and I are going to be discussing today. So welcome to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's most trusted property commentator who has once again been voted Australia's leading property investment advisor. That's the 5th time he's won a similar award in the last 7 years.
Turn on the news these days and you'd be forgiven for thinking the world's about to end. From politics to climate change to the economy, negative and bad news surround us everywhere we go. The problem isn't just that there are terrible things happening around the world, but it's partly also because our brains are wired to pay more attention to unpleasant news. Psychologists call this negativity bias, and they've found that it's one of the first things we develop as a child. Now, interestingly, I was having a chat with my good friend Pete Wargent a couple of weeks ago when he mentioned about the sort of blog posts that he writes that get the most attention, the negative ones. So it led us to think, let's have a chat about this. So today, once again, my regular guest is Pete Wargent, one of Australia's leading finance and economic commentators. Welcome, Pete.
Thanks, Michael.
Now, Pete, this is in some ways a protective mechanism, isn't it? There's a strong body of evidence that illustrates the human tendency to prioritise negative things against positive things. I guess when we were out in the savannah, if you heard a rustle in the leaves, you'd think it was a saber-toothed tiger and it would protect you, but if you thought it was the wind, you could get eaten.
Yeah, that's it. So we're essentially hardwired to respond to negative words in particular or negative events. So especially if you're reading the media, if you see things like war or murder or bombing, those are the kind of words that we naturally respond to. And there have been studies that actually show that. But unfortunately, if you see those headlines in the morning, I mean, even just a few minutes of that, it can cast a shadow over your whole day, which is pretty tough, especially if you're genuinely interested in world events like what's going on in Hong Kong with all the unrest and violence. And it's very difficult actually to get away from it these days.
Well, I guess the context we're talking about is how it affects us as investors, as business people, as entrepreneurs. So we'll get onto that in a moment. But the media seems to exaggerate the negative news, Pete. There's a distortion that then leads to, as you were starting to say, consumer sentiment. If you continuously hear bad news, hear negative headlines, it has to affect the way you think, the way you invest, whether you take risks in your business or financial life, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think that, the big thing that's changed over the past dozen years or so is that so much of the media is now online. And of course, online media, it's a desperate competition for clicks. So it's almost going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy now. that we'll just get more and more bad news headlines because if people in the media know that that generates clicks, and as you mentioned, I know from my own analytics, I always get 5 times as many readers if I write about negative situations or market crashes. Always the same, 5 times as many readers. So um, it's not going away. So you need a coping mechanism to deal with it because you're just going to get more and more of this type of headline.
Well, as you say, your blogs and my blogs similarly get more clicks, more readership if there's a negative headline. I also find it interesting that when you look at the various YouTube channels, there are some very good media outlets there giving credible sources of information. But the ones with the biggest readership, the most views, the most clicks seem to be the ones who are pessimistic, who are negative, aren't they?
Well, when it comes to finance and the economy, it's actually a different dynamic. So, if we read about a war or cancer or bombings, some people, I guess a very small minority, might have a sort of a ghoulish fascination, but it's mostly just, as you mentioned, it's that negativity bias that we're driven, or we're just hardwired to respond to that sort of story. But I think when it comes to finance and the economy, I mean, a huge driver of it is just Schadenfreude. People want to see other people not doing well because there's only really, two ways you can get ahead of your peer group. One is by you succeeding, and the other is by them failing. I mean, it must be 20 odd years since I read it, but I remember George Orwell in The Road to Wigan Pier saying that the 1930s, when the indignity of people being unemployed, it was actually much more bearable if everybody else was unemployed as well. And I think that's a huge driver of it for finance and economic news. An awful lot of people out there who are really praying for a recession, a property crash, a stock market crash, not because they're participating, but because they want other people to fail.
That is a form of jealousy, isn't it? And Schadenfreude is a beautiful German word for it. The problem is this is actually quite a vocal, I guess, minority on the internet. And they complain that the government is continuously helping the rich get richer. It's unfair in Australia. First homeowners aren't able to get in because of ugly, greedy property investors. It seems to me that in general, Australians are doing pretty well. We look at all the wealth reports, and we're amongst the richest people in the world. On average, our income's around $80,000. And so the average Australian couple has got an income of $150,000, $160,000. They should be able to buy a property somewhere. But these people on the internet keep talking about Ponzi schemes. They're anti-developers. In fact, it's the developers who are going to build all those big apartment buildings that will allow more of them to buy homes in the first place, Pete.
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, as you said, there's certainly a big, or it's a minority, but it's a fair chunk of people who actually take a curious comfort in negativity and the economy struggling or falling on hard times. I think it goes back to that thing that most of us actually believe that we're better than average, but of course we can't all be that. And as you said, the wealth statistics for Australia, we've had a 2-year sort of downdraft for household wealth, but it's very quickly rebounded. Stocks are up 25% since Christmas Eve last year in Australia, plus the housing markets in Sydney and Melbourne are rebounding really quickly. So household wealth is going to go blazing to a record high in 2020. And in fact, the average household wealth, so the mean, is actually over $1 million per household now, which is it's quite remarkable. But as you said, it does tend to get skewed towards people that take action and people who participate in the economy, investors, business owners, and people who actually get out there and do it.
That's the beauty in Australia. Look, most of the people listening to this podcast are going to be in Western countries, and I know we actually have a very large international audience, but most of them are in Australia and in wealthy Western countries. And in those countries, wealth doesn't discriminate. Money doesn't care who you are, what your background is, what your university education is. Those who take action can become wealthy. It's been shown over and over again that most millionaires today are self-made millionaires. They've actually spent less than they've earned. They've practiced delayed gratification. They've invested. They've taken a level of risk. And it's a pretty good place to live in Australia. It grows, continuously win awards. Australia's cities, Melbourne City, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth Brisbane are all in the top 20 most livable cities in the world. Melbourne and Sydney coming in 2 or 3. The OECD Better Life Index has said Australia's the great place to live. Yet people, they seem to be negative. And as you say, it's hardwired. I think another issue today, Pete, is social media. People see people's highlight reels. They don't see all the stuff on the cutting room floor. It's actually become the news source for many people today, Pete.
Yeah, so that's definitely one of the popular choices for people who are trying to manage their information intake, ditching things like Facebook and Instagram, which doesn't really give a real picture of the real world. People just post the highlights package or the highlights reels. Yeah, you definitely want to take a careful approach to where you get your information and news from. If you're going to be thinking about that wisely, I spoke at an event in the Gold Coast this year. I was talking to Casey Edwards, who's an author, and she writes for the Sydney Morning Herald, and she actually gave a speech on who you should listen to in life. And she basically has a little card in her wallet, and it says, listen to people who, if you respect them, if you respect their opinion, if they've got your best interests at heart, and also people who actually show up, because you get an awful lot of people who'll chirp and criticize and just sit on the sidelines of life. But at the end of the day, why would you be influenced by people like that? I've always believed if you want to achieve something, the easiest and the fastest route to get there is to actually follow people who have achieved what you want to achieve and just improve your social circle that way rather than just listening to the constant negativity, because I think that will always be there.
I think that's a good point. Your social circle is very important. I remember years ago when I was sitting with clients, I met a young guy, a really nice gentleman who was actually a bricklayer, and he was from the western suburbs of Melbourne, and he'd bought his first investment property and he was thinking of buying another one. And his mates in the pub said, "What are you doing that for? Why don't you buy a new ute? Why don't you buy a new car? Go camping, get a caravan." And I said to him, that's the group of people you're dealing with. But if you actually went to the pub in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne around here rather than in the western suburbs, they'd be probably talking about their stock picks and how their business is going. So it does make a big difference. Your circle of friends very much influences you.
Yeah, it definitely does. I mean, there's an old saying that says you become the sum of the half a dozen people you spend the most time with. I do believe that's true, because even if it's an unconscious thing, you just can't help but start to mirror the behaviors of the people you spend the most time with. So if you want to be a successful business person, mix with people who've grown successful businesses. Exactly the same if you want to be a property developer. It's not much use hanging around with people who just sit around finding problems, because you actually need to find people who've been there and done it, and try and surround yourself with positive and like-minded people.
Makes a big difference. And it also has to do with the things you listen to, the things you read, the blogs you read, the podcasts you listen to, because it's very easy to find people who want to be negative. But gee, there's a lot of positivity out there if you look for it. Yes, there's difficulties. Yes, there's headwinds. Yes, there's going to be job problems, business problems, health problems, relationship problems. But I think gratitude's a really important element of feeling wealthy and moving forward too.
Yeah, it definitely is. And in fact, if you're persistently negative, you'll miss out on so many opportunities, because it doesn't matter if you're talking about the stock market, where the dividends come every year and the long-term trend is always up. And it's the same in property. Market spends most of the time going up. And yet people, even now, they're still talking about, the Los Angeles property bubble of 2004 and stuff like that. Those people are just driven by the need to be either right or contrarian. But actually, if you're persistently negative, you'll just miss out on so much upside. So it doesn't mean you shouldn't be careful. You should always be careful, but you've got to recognise that the long-term trend actually favours people who go long and buy, and not people who sit on the sidelines.
Very much so. And that's one of the rich habits that both our friend Tom Corley has come up with as well. But again, getting back to the news, we actually recognise that you've got to be careful what you listen to and who you listen to, as I said a moment ago, because news is about things that happen, not things that don't happen. So they actually don't report all that good stuff. You never see a journalist reporting from a country that the war hasn't broken out, or the city hasn't been bombed, or a school hasn't been shot up. And it's really much the same with the finance and investment news. They love the auction clearances when they're really, really high or they're really, really low. But when it actually just gently, quietly keeps increasing, they don't tend to report that. I think there's a couple of ways we can look at avoiding getting caught in this bubble. And one of them is to recognize that social media isn't a particularly good news source because anyone can put things up there. And slow down, pick your battles, decide you've got to keep informed. You've got to actually listen even to contrary views, not just your own views. So I'm not saying just listen to your own view, because you've got to be exposed to other ideas, but have a think about who you're listening to, because there are perma bears out there, aren't there? There's the same people year after year who've been telling us, I believe Harry Dent's been back again, telling us that the world is going to come to an end, Armageddon's happening, the property market's going to crash, but they're just kicking the can down the road. Okay, it wasn't this year, it's going to be next year, it's going to be the year after.
Well, yeah, and look, you've been around long enough to know, Michael, that it's the same in every asset class. It doesn't matter if you're talking about stocks or vintage cars or the property market. The same dynamics exist now as they always did. Summer seasons followed by winter seasons, followed by summer seasons. It's never going to change. You've just got to recognize that it's a cycle. We've been through a 2-year, an engineered downturn in the end. And the market came out of that downturn in May, and people are still arguing the toss. No, the market's not rebounding, but the cycle's moved on. The crowd is always a day late. So, yeah, people are very often fighting yesterday's war instead of just recognizing where we're at in the cycle and acting accordingly.
Well, I guess it still falls down to the fact that there's two groups of people. People like you and me, we've all made our investment mistakes. We've learned from it. We can now look back with the benefit of hindsight of history, with our good long memories, and understand the cycles better. And until you've lived through a couple of cycles, you're not really a good investor in my mind. And so I can definitely understand why beginning investors get caught up in the fear of greed, the fear of missing out, and then the fear during a cycle, the first downturn also. But there are some people who just don't learn. They've been through it. They've seen the cycles. They've seen what's going on, and they're still worried. And I guess that gets back to the point we first made, that they're hardwired to worry. It must be a very difficult thing being in their mind, Pete.
Well, yeah, it is actually. It's an evolutionary mechanism, because there's an old saying that people would rather fail conventionally than succeed by doing something different. It's amazing how groupthink takes hold, and we'll see it, I suspect, in the stock market in 2020. After a 10-year bull market, people have they think, well, the market's going up, everybody's making money, but people find great comfort in going with the crowd instead of doing what they should do and buying when markets are cheap. People pile in towards the peak, and we saw this in Sydney and Melbourne property markets over the 2-year downturn. Best buying conditions you can imagine, but nobody wants to buy in a downturn. So it's an evolutionary thing. There's comfort to be found in groups and crowds, but it's not necessarily the best route to success.
Well, Pete, that means that despite us thinking we're rational, we're not. We think irrationally, just like that herd mentality, because in the old days, it was safe to stick with the herd, with the crowd, rather than be separated and eaten by that saber-toothed tiger. There's a whole science of behavioural finance and why we don't behave rationally. So I think we should actually have a talk about that in a future podcast. But I guess the lesson from today's chat is that be careful about how you think. Remember that we're living in the best country in the world at the best time in history. Yes, there's bad news and there's good news. There's always both. But in fact, if you look for the good things, you'll find them. And if you look for the negativity, you'll find them also. So walk around looking for good things. Be grateful for what you've got, because boy, we could be a lot worse off than we are, Pete.
Absolutely. Imagine 10 or 15 years ago saying that not only is life expectancy increasing and child mortality is falling, but actually to live in a country where the average household wealth is $1 million plus now. Now, of course, not every household is that far along the journey, but there's an abundance of opportunity in a democratic Western style country like Australia. All the opportunities are there, so why not surround yourself with positive interactions? I think there was a psychologist in the US found that a happy marriage needs 5 times as many positive interactions as negative to actually be successful and thrive. And it's a bit the same with your business and your investing. If you spend your whole time mixing with negative people, it's just going to hold you back. So you want to try and apply the same principle: 5 times as many positive interactions as negative.
I think the other thing you just said brought home a point also, that a lot of people aren't at that $1 million wealth level yet because they're still at the early parts of their journey. So don't compare your chapter 2 with my chapter 30 or your chapter 25, Pete, because you've been in the market for a long, long time too. So a lot of the wealth in Australia is in the hands of baby boomers, and the young people see that as ugly, greedy baby boomers who are pushing them out of the market and living in the best parts of Australia. But they didn't start there. They started living in small apartments and houses in the outer suburbs and had to work for years. They didn't have the benefit of superannuation or a lot of the social benefits or health benefits that are around today.
No, that's it. And I was laughing the other day. I appeared on a television channel and they referred to me as a veteran analyst. And I was thinking, gee whiz, it was only about 3 or 4 years ago I was considered a promising youngster. But it's just that is the nature of compound growth, though. It wasn't so very long ago, it seems, that I was coming out of university in London. The housing market was too expensive. Stock prices were in a bubble. UK had a recession. Everything seems stacked against you when you're young, but a combination of leverage, compound growth, and time, it does amazing things for your wealth. So as long as you stay the course and just try to avoid making silly mistakes, time will work wonders for you.
Fantastic. So thanks again for our chat. I always have fun with these and look forward to catching up with you again real soon on the Michael Yardney podcast. Now, oh, by the way, before we finish off, Pete, if people want to get more of your great information, your daily blogs, your charts, your graphs, how do they find out about you?
Check it out at Pete Wargent Blogspot. So that's petewargent.blogspot.com. That's my daily blog. And if you like a few videos and some details on our coaching programs, you can check out gonextlevelwealth.com.au. Loads of free information there.
And I love those videos, Pete, because they're short. So all those people who have a shorter attention span will love it because lots of information packed into a short time. Catch up with you again real soon, Pete.
Cheers.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
Well, we're well into the new year already, but to help you make this a great year, I'd like to share with you the importance of having a growth mindset. Now, I did a whole podcast on this with Tom Corley in one of our monthly Rich Habits, Poor Habits podcasts. You can go back and have a look at the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. But let me quickly remind you, but maybe I can do that by asking you to think back, go way back in time. Go back to the time when you were a child. You there? Now, I want you to think about what you didn't know as a child. And if you think about it, the list was long, wasn't it? At some point, you didn't even know how to tie your shoes, let alone about the property market or success or business or money or what makes a good investment, the things you're thinking about today. But here you are today, and you're in a job and you've got children, you're probably very good at what you do, and certain people rely on you, maybe your children, your spouse, your parents, your clients. But I've got a question for you. You help all these other people learn. How committed are you to learning new things? You see, as I started to say, there's this thing called a growth mindset. And if you've got a growth mindset, you believe that your talents can be developed through hard work, through good strategies, through input from others. This means you think you can do more and learn how to do something better. On the other hand, there are people around with what's called a fixed mindset, and they believe their talents are innate, their innate gifts, and that's all they can do. In other words, they believe they're stuck with what they've got. Now, I understand why some people have a fixed mindset. In fact, they develop a fixed mindset. Learning new things can be hard. It moves you out of your comfort zone. But because you're here right now, because you're listening to this podcast, you're learning something new, you know it's possible to change. So I feel pretty confident that you've got a growth mindset. I want you to think about a couple of things. First of all, you're not perfect, and so you're going to fail at some things. Failure can lead to criticism, and criticism can trigger a fixed mindset. Now, that's okay, but give yourself permission to fail. But commit to identifying the triggers that switch you from thinking growth to thinking fixed. Identify them and untwig them. The other thing I want you to remember is that you won't have a growth mindset about everything. There are just some things I'm bad at, and more practice just doesn't seem to help much, so I get frustrated, and that's okay too. For some things, we've just got to let go. Now, I know for some investors, they're going to have to let go that thing at the back of their head that says they've got to try and time the market perfectly, try and get the perfect property investment. It doesn't work that way. Look, we're human, and part of being human is pushing to be better this year than we were last year. And by adopting a growth mindset, you can find a path that's going to help you become a better person, a better communicator, better in life in all sorts of things. So have a great 2020. Make this a great year. The aim of the Michael Yardney podcast is to help you become more successful, not just in property and real estate, but in all areas of your life, including the areas of money and wealth. But the way you do one thing is the way you do everything. As I explained right at the beginning of the show, your thoughts lead to your feelings lead to your actions, and your actions lead to your results. And that's why a lot of the content in my show isn't just the hard content about property and data, but also about the psychology of success. Now, if you want lots of data and you want lots of information about what's happening to our property markets in 2020 and the next 2 or 3 years, actually, why not join me at my national property market and economic updates that are coming up in March and April in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. And while there's normally a cost of $99, I've made this year a special effort to get as many people there as possible, so you can come as my guest if you use the coupon code podcast. Just go to propertymarketupdate.com.au and use the coupon code podcast. A link to this and the reminder of that coupon code is in the show notes. But if you got some benefit from today's show, and you'd like to help others, just like I'm trying to get as many people as possible up the rungs, up the ladder to help them become financially successful, I'd like you to help me as well. Just share the show. Tell people about it. The old-fashioned way, just click a link on the podcast app, the share button, or tell somebody about it, or use it through social media. And if you want to tell the world, I'd love to get your review on iTunes or wherever you leave reviews. You can leave a 1-star, a 5-star, but everyone seems to be leaving 5 stars, and that makes me feel really happy. And if I read out your review, as I'm about to read it out for Dame Nika, and you email me, michael@metropole.com.au, I'll gift you one of my books as a way of saying thank you. And Dame Nika wrote at the end of last year on Apple Podcasts, transformational, inspirational and insightful. I'm so glad I came across Michael Yardney's podcast, as it made me realise how amateurish my approach was to property investment. I started following the podcast at the beginning of 2019 and can't believe the shift in my mindset. I love what Michael covers in the topics of psychology to economics. I always look forward to the next episode. I also read most of Michael's books and would sincerely recommend him, actually hoping that there'll be an updated edition of what every property investor needs to know about finance, tax and the law, he said. Anyway, thank you for your podcast, right, Dame Nika? I said he, but I guess it's a she. Thank you for the podcast and sharing your knowledge. It's definitely brought my value into my life and made a significant difference. The investment strategies made so much sense to me. I've decided to join Metropole, and I recently did. I must say, it feels really uplifting to have a professional and caring team behind you. Well, thank you so much for trusting us, and I look forward to being part of your wealth creation journey, Dame Nika. And as for you, the person who's listening to this podcast, I'll be back twice a week sharing insights into property investment success and money. But you can catch me in between at Property Update, and particularly on social media. So follow me at Michael Yardney, and lately I've been spending a bit more time on Instagram. I'd like to find out a bit more about you, so why not connect? And if you want to keep up to date, as I said, subscribe to my daily property update newsletter at propertyupdate.com.au. I'll catch you real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?